The French Bulldog, you know, that compact, flat-faced companion, might be a total lie. We've always been told this breed was a 19th century invention, but new ancient DNA evidence from a 2,000-year-old Roman tomb just broke that timeline wide open. Today, we're uncovering why the modern Frenchie is actually a ghost from the ancient world, and why your dog's history is far older and more complicated than any kennel club will tell you, and that tension matters. For years, the French Bulldog has been described through the lens of modern breeding alone, as if its identity were built almost entirely in recent memory. Yet the genetic evidence suggests a different arrangement. Instead of a clean beginning, there may have been continuities carried forward in fragments through crossbreeding, selection, and repeated human preference for certain shapes. The present breed suddenly looks less like a neat endpoint and more like a chapter in a much longer passage of canines adapted to live beside people who were drawn to small size, short faces, and an easy closeness. The surprising part is not just that the past is older, it is that the past is recognizable. A dog from a 2,000-year-old tomb in Turkey can look like it belongs in the same visual family as a French Bulldog on a modern street, and that resemblance is enough to make the usual timeline feel too narrow. What if the breed did not emerge from a single moment of creation, but from layers of human selection stacked over centuries, each generation preserving a feature that had already been admired long before the name French Bulldog existed? That is where ancient DNA becomes more than a scientific tool. It becomes a witness. It reaches into remains that cannot speak and pulls a new line through history, connecting Roman burial practices, ancient companionship, and the modern French Bulldog in a way that feels both intimate and unresolved. The dog we think we know may be carrying echoes from a world that had no idea it was helping to shape the future of the breed. And once that possibility appears, the rest of the story stops looking simple. The French Bulldog is no longer just a modern icon with a clear pedigree. It becomes evidence that memory can survive in bodies, that selection can preserve older desires, and that evolution often hides inside affection long before anyone gives it a name. If this kind of hidden ancestry changes how you see the French Bulldog, stay with the story, because the next layer is where the familiar pedigree starts to break apart. The first thing that unsettles the timeline is not a puppy, not a kennel, not a breed registry. It is a set of bones from 3 archaeological sites in southeast France, dated to the Middle Neolithic, and examined in 2009 with a kind of patience that modern dogs never get to enjoy. In that study, researchers did not find a neat, single origin story. They found 2 haplotypes belonging to lineage C in the hypervariable region I of mitochondrial DNA, a small genetic detail with a large consequence. The region already held genetic diversity long before anyone spoke of a French Bulldog as a breed. That matters because it changes the feeling of the evidence. The Roman tomb in Turkey had suggested an old taste for compact companions with shortened muzzles, but the Neolithic material from southeast France pushes the problem deeper. It implies that the pool from which later dogs emerged was already varied, already carrying branches that could be selected, lost, replaced, or carried forward, depending on what people valued in different places and times. The body of the dog was never static. The record shows movement, substitution, and survival all at once. The study, published through Science Direct under the title Ancient DNA, supports lineage replacement in European dog gene pool. Insight into Neolithic southeast France does not give a picture of one pure ancestral line flowing calmly into the present. Instead, it hints at a turnover in the European dog gene pool, where lineages could vanish from one moment of occupation and return in another, or be overshadowed by incoming populations with their own preferred shapes and behaviors. In other words, the face people later came to recognize in the French Bulldog was not simply invented in a Victorian city and then frozen into place. The traits that made that face possible were being shuffled through older canine populations much earlier, under pressures no breed club could have controlled. And that is where the story becomes stranger. If the Neolithic dogs of southeast France already carried diversity in lineage C, then the popular idea of a clean, recent creation begins to look too narrow. Selection did not start with a name. It started with choices that left traces in mitochondrial DNA, with humans keeping some dogs close, letting others disappear, and preserving certain lines because they fit a way of living that favored small bodies, social temperaments, and faces people found worth repeating. The modern breed is only the last visible layer of a much older process. You can almost feel the ground shift under the pedigree. One clue points to a Roman burial, another to Middle Neolithic France, and together they refuse to stay in separate boxes. The timeline no longer moves in a straight line from origin to standard. It behaves like a braided path, where different eras keep leaving marks on the same animal. That is why the French Bulldog cannot be read as a simple product of recent taste. It is a descendant of repeated human decisions, old genetic continuities, and losses that never made it into the show ring story. Listen closely to what the evidence is doing here. It is not only confirming that dogs were diverse in the past, it is showing that the ingredients behind a later breed were already circulating across Europe, waiting for new circumstances to pull them into a different form, a compact body, a familiar expression, a particular balance of dependence and alertness. None of that appears out of nowhere. It is assembled over time from older materials, some visible, some only recoverable when researchers go back to the bones themselves. If this kind of ancestry is reshaping how the French Bulldog is understood, stay with the investigation, because the next layer is where the clues stop behaving like separate findings and start looking like one long human-made selection thread. What ancient DNA reveals is not just age, but pressure. It shows when a population was broad, when it narrowed, and when human preference began to squeeze variation into a smaller and smaller frame. That is where the French Bulldog's story starts to look less like a clean origin and more like a warning written into blood. By the time researchers compare ancient material with later dogs, the pattern is clear enough to unsettle the tidy version of breed history. There were old regional lineages, yes, and there were dogs moving through Europe long before kennel clubs ever gave them names. But the deeper lesson is that a breed can look stable from the outside, while its genetic foundation has already been edited by centuries of selection, loss, and reuse. The body becomes a surface. The genome keeps the record. A useful mirror appears in a different bulldog line. In 2016, a study published in Canine Genetics and Epidemiology, titled A Genetic Assessment of the English Bulldog, examined 102 registered English bulldogs. The result was stark: a significant loss of genetic diversity traced to a small founder population and to artificial bottlenecks created by intense selection for specific physical traits. In plain terms, the breed had been pulled through a narrow gate so many times that variation had nowhere left to go. That matters here because the French Bulldog is often imagined through the same narrow lens: a compact shape, a short muzzle, a body built to fit a human preference. Yet the genetic story keeps reminding us that such a form does not emerge from appearance alone. Once a population is repeatedly rewarded for a fixed outline, other traits fall away, and what remains can look inevitable only after the fact. The dog in front of us seems designed, but the design is also a history of subtraction, and ancient DNA makes that subtraction visible in a way old portraits and breeding notes never could. A bone fragment, a tooth, a trace from an archaeological layer can show whether diversity once existed, where later records pretend there was only one line. It can expose continuities that were never celebrated, and breaks that were never admitted. The past is not silent. It is only harder to hear until the right sequence is read. That is why the comparison with the English Bulldog is so revealing. It shows how fast a population can collapse under concentrated breeding pressure, and how quickly a set of chosen traits can become a genetic trap. Once that happens, the animal's identity is no longer held together by one origin, but by repeated interventions that keep rewriting what survives. The French Bulldog sits inside that same tension, a breed read as modern and deliberate, yet carrying signs that the ground beneath it was prepared long before the final image appeared. If you want to understand why this matters beyond one breed, stay with the thread, because the next step is where ancestry stops looking like a family tree and starts looking like a map of surviving fragments. The meaning of the French Bulldog changes there, not simply a product of taste, but a living result of memory, restriction, and adaptation that still has not finished speaking. In 2016, the picture became harder to ignore. Researchers at the University of California, Davis looked at the English Bulldog and found a gene pool so small that it could barely carry the weight of its own future. The study, published in Canine Genetics and Epidemiology, and later summarized by UC Davis in the report English Bulldog's Gene Pool May Be Too Small to Heal the Breed, pointed to a breed shaped by a tiny founding population and then tightened further by artificial genetic bottlenecks. That detail changes the story. It means the face people recognize today is not only the result of style or taste, it is also the visible edge of a much narrower biological path. When a breed passes through repeated selection for a few physical traits, the range of what it can inherit shrinks. Health becomes harder to improve, not because the animal is weak in some simple sense, but because the room for variation has already been taken away. In that 2016 work, the sample included 102 registered English bulldogs, and the message was clear enough to unsettle even experienced breeders. A population can become so concentrated that recovery is no longer just a matter of choosing different parents. And this is where the French Bulldog enters the frame with a different kind of pressure. The ancient DNA findings had already shown that the breed's past reaches farther back than the modern image suggests. But now another layer appears. If a related breed could be compressed so severely in a recent period, then the French Bulldog cannot be read as a simple icon of selective success. It belongs to a lineage where form was repeatedly narrowed, where each generation inherited not just traits, but limits. For a moment, that seems like the whole answer. A modern breed, a small founder base, a narrowing of diversity, and a body built inside those constraints. Yet the older DNA data refuses to let the story stop there. The archaeological sequences from earlier dogs still sit in the background, carrying a wider spread of variation than the present breed seems to allow. So the real question becomes less about whether the French Bulldog is genetically restricted, and more about when that restriction hardened, and what was lost when it did. That distinction matters. A narrow gene pool does not appear overnight. It is made by choices, by fashion, by closed lines, by repeated decisions that reward one look and ignore another. Over time, those choices can create a breed that appears stable on the surface, while becoming less flexible inside. The result is not just a dog with a particular head shape or compact frame. It is a living record of how selection can turn preference into inheritance, and inheritance into constraint. The French Bulldog, seen this way, is no longer just a modern pet with a recognizable silhouette. It is a small, breathing archive of pressures that kept pulling the same way until diversity thinned. The ancient DNA does not erase that reality. It places it inside a longer span, where old variation, later bottlenecks, and present-day limits all belong to the same chain. And once that chain is visible, the breed's identity starts to feel less fixed than it looks, as if the surface everyone knows is only the last chapter of a much older biological narrowing. Then a small tail bends the whole argument sideways. In 2019, researchers at the University of California, Davis, traced a mutation in disheveled 2, or DVL2, through bulldogs, French bulldogs, and Boston terriers. The visible sign was the same one breeders had noticed for generations, the twisted, curled tail known as a screw tail. But the finding did more than name a trait. It connected 3 different breeds through a shared molecular change, as if a hidden line had been running beneath their separate histories all along. That matters because a tail is easy to read and easy to misread. In a kennel, in a show ring, in a photograph, it can seem like a simple signature of type. Yet the UC Davis work showed that the signature sits deeper than posture or style. DVL2 is part of a developmental pathway, and its disruption helps explain why the same altered tail appears in animals that do not share a single recent origin story. The resemblance is not a coincidence of shape. It is a biological echo, and once that echo is heard, the French Bulldog starts to change again in the mind. The breed is no longer standing alone as a polished modern creation. It is positioned beside the Bulldog and the Boston Terrier, not as a copy of either one, but as a relative carrying one of the same inherited marks. The compact body, the shortened muzzle, the curled tail, each feature begins to look less like an isolated aesthetic decision and more like a visible outcome of deeper genetic pathways being selected, narrowed, and preserved. The twist is that this shared marker also reaches beyond dog history into human medicine. UC Davis described the discovery as a clue relevant to a human genetic disease, which means the mutation is not merely a curiosity about appearance. It is a reminder that the same developmental machinery can shape a tail in a dog and signal broader biological disruption elsewhere. What seems like a decorative detail at first becomes a map of how form is built, altered, and inherited. For the French Bulldog, that map is unsettling in a quiet way. It suggests that some of the features we use to define a breed are not only the product of later selection, but the surface expression of a deeper change that crossed breed boundaries. The lineage is still distinctive, but it is less sealed than it appeared a few scenes ago. A shared mutation does not erase difference. It exposes the hidden common ground under it. So the question shifts again. If one trait can link bulldogs, French bulldogs, and Boston Terriers through DVL2, what else in the French bulldog's frame may be carrying an older instruction, one written into development rather than style? The answer is not fully visible yet, and that is what keeps the history alive. Each layer confirmed by ancient DNA or modern genetics pulls another one into view, until the breed feels less like a finished design and more like a record of repeated edits that still have consequences. That is why this evidence lands so hard. It gives the French bulldog a second ancestry, one in kennels and registries, another in the body's own construction code. If you want to see how far that hidden code reaches, stay with the next turn of the investigation, because the smallest feature may be carrying the oldest clue. By 2016, the Bulldog English had already become a warning written in plain sight. A study published in Canine Genetics and Epidemiology showed that its genetic diversity was extremely low, shaped by a small founder population and by artificial bottlenecks that narrowed the gene pool again and again. University of California, Davis put it bluntly in its public report. The breed's gene pool may be too small to heal the breed. That line matters, because it changes the way you read every compact head, every shortened muzzle, every body plan that seems fixed and complete. It is not only about appearance, it is about how little room a lineage may have left to recover once selection has pressed it into a narrow shape. And that is where the French bulldog becomes harder to read, not easier. The temptation is to treat a recognizable face as proof of a settled origin, as if a breed seen in modern kennels must have arrived there through a clean and recent design. But the Bulldog English shows the opposite. Once a small founding group is chosen, and once human preference keeps reinforcing the same traits, what looks stable can actually be genetically fragile. The surface stays familiar, while the inheritance underneath gets thinner. This is why the ancient DNA thread matters so much. It does not merely add an older date to the same tale, it exposes how easily a breed can appear finished while still carrying the trace of repeated narrowing. In the French Bulldog, that means the compact frame, the compressed profile, and the entire sense of a neatly defined identity may be standing on a history of choices that stacked up faster than the body could diversify. The old material and the modern genomes are not telling two separate stories. They are showing a pattern, a small base, a strong filter, and consequences that linger long after the first selection is forgotten. Seen from that angle, the question is no longer whether the French Bulldog belongs to a simple modern origin story. The question is what part of its present form was inherited from deeper canine history, and what part was locked in by recent pressure so intense that it left little genetic breathing room. That difference changes everything. A breed with a narrow pool does not just carry traits, it carries limits. It can preserve a look for generations while quietly losing the flexibility that would let it move beyond its own design. And that is the uncomfortable lesson hidden inside the Bulldog English research from 2016. The real danger is not only that a breed may become too uniform to improve easily. It is that the uniformity itself can be mistaken for completion. For the French Bulldog, ancient DNA now asks a sharper question. If the body was edited by history, by breeding, and by inherited developmental instructions, how much of what seems modern is actually a late form of something older still? If you want the answer to keep unfolding, stay close, because the next layer is where identity starts to separate from the face that first seemed to define it. By the time the genetic evidence settles into place, the face of the French Bulldog stops looking like a simple modern invention and starts looking like a continuation, not a straight line, not a clean beginning, a continuation of something older, filtered through human preference, survival, and repeated selection until the breed became a compact symbol of companionship. The DNA does not say that today's French Bulldog was copied intact from a Roman dog or pulled directly out of one ancient population. What it says is more unsettling and more useful. The short-faced body did not appear from nowhere, and the story of brachycephaly reaches farther back than the kennel records that usually define it. That changes the meaning of every visible feature. The skull is no longer only a shape. The muzzle is no longer only a style. The heavy, crowded look people associate with the breed becomes part of a longer biological memory, one shaped by choices made across centuries. Archaeology points to small dogs in Roman times with traits that already echo this profile, while ancient DNA shows that the canine world carried deeper layers of diversity and exchange than modern breed labels can capture. So the French Bulldog does not stand at the beginning of the story. It stands near the end of a much older chain, where form, function, and human taste kept intersecting. And once that is clear, another layer opens, the tension between identity and fragility. In 2016, a study published by the University of California, Davis, in Canine Genetics and Epidemiology, warned that the English Bulldog's gene pool may be too small to heal the breed. The researchers tied that weakness to a small founder population and to artificial genetic bottlenecks that narrowed the breed so severely that improving health becomes difficult. That finding matters here because it shows how a fixed look can come at a cost. A breed can be stabilized in appearance, while its genetic room to adapt shrinks almost to nothing. Seen from that angle, the French Bulldog is carrying more than a fashionable profile. It is carrying the record of selection pressure, inherited development, and decisions that prioritized one kind of body over another. The same forces that helped define the modern breed also make it vulnerable to the limits inside its own history. And that is why ancient DNA matters so much. It does not merely add age to the story. It widens the frame until the breed can be understood as part of a much older conversation about domestication, companionship, and the trade-offs written into living bodies. So the final answer is not a simple origin date. It is a deeper recognition. The French Bulldog is both modern and old, both shaped and inherited, both a product of recent breeding and a reminder that certain canine forms were valued long before the breed itself existed. That is what the genetic work really changes. It gives memory back to a face that seemed self-explanatory, and it shows that survival is never only about staying the same. It is about carrying forward what history allowed, what humans preferred, and what the genome managed to keep. If this deeper layer changed how you see the breed, stay with the next part, and share it with someone who still thinks appearance tells the whole story.